I felt really disrespected by him because he didn't even finish listening to me. And I said this in private, I wasn't calling him out publicly or anything. The hate crime bill start by providing an overarching infrastructure or framework. And with any public health crisis, if you will, of this magnitude, we need to know what's going on.
Welcome to The Tiger in the Room. My name is Hannah, and I'll be your host. We are a podcast series that is here to talk about the current and ongoing national crisis of anti-Asian hate crimes. A lot of us first heard about anti-Asian hate in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. We believe that hate against Asians and Asian Americans is not just seen in acts of violence. It is also seen when our community is silenced, invisibilized, and erased. We plan to talk about the challenges that modern-day Asian Americans face every day, whether it's in the workplace, in public, in media, and so on. We also talk to the organizers, activists, and change makers who are fighting for our community and fighting for change. We hope you'll join us. Our guest today is Congresswoman Grace Meng, who represents New York's 6th Congressional District. Grace is perhaps one of the most recognizable national public figures currently speaking out against anti-Asian hate. She has served as the Congresswoman since 2013 and is the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State, as well as the first female Congress member from Queens since former vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. Among the many initiatives Grace has spearheaded, key legislation that she has introduced or helped pass was removing the word Oriental from federal law, establishing the first step in creating a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture, and introducing and passing the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law. She is also the first Asian American to hold the position of Vice Chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. We talked to Grace about her efforts to get the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act passed, her thoughts on how the country is taking anti-Asian hate crimes more seriously, and her comments around her remarks during a rally for the late Michelle Go in Times Square in 2022.
America, dear America, why they hate you run deep in America, why they want to kill me in America.
This interview with Congresswoman Grace Meng was recorded on July 21st, 2023. So, Grace, before I dive into the question, I do want to inform our listeners a bit of our personal history. So, many years ago, I won't say how many years ago, I used to intern for you, actually, when you were then Assemblywoman Grace Meng. What was really memorable for me was just, that was my first job in public service, really. Just getting to talk to constituents and really understanding what their day-to-day struggles and issues were, and a lot of them being Asian American, unsurprisingly. I just want to ask you, how did your early days of, being an Assemblywoman and working with Asian Americans at like the local constituent level, how did that help you in the role that you're playing now, where you're advocating for these issues more at a national level?
I love that you're asking me this because very few people have asked me this, but it's something that I actually think about a lot. I think you and I first met when we were kind of in our formative years, respectfully in, our career paths. You obviously still a student. And I was really honored to be able to serve the community and the state legislature. One thing that I do miss, like from the assembly to Congress, is that the district is obviously much bigger, like a couple 100,000 more constituents. And so it's harder to have that one-on-one with constituents, where I remember back in the assembly day, I could literally sit at the front desk and, say hi to people. And because of the schedule and because of the size of the district, it becomes a lot harder to do. And now, one of the reasons why I went to Congress or wanted to go was to be able to help people on a much larger scale, to help more people, not just in my district, in the state, but across the country.
So talk to me about the last couple of years, because, as you know, anti-Asian hate is not something that's new, but I think it certainly got a lot more attention at the national level after COVID-19 came about. It took, well over a year of, violent attacks happening before the media actually started to cover these attacks, key incidents being the murder of Visharadana Pakti and, the Atlanta spa shootings, which finally got people to start paying attention. And I remember reading about, you were confronting the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy in 2020, about him using the term Chinese coronavirus. And, the fact he dismissed it. But then fast forward a year later, you got more than 100 lawmakers to support the hate crimes bill just within the first few days. So, I just want to know, what was your experience like going from those early days when, anti-Asian hate didn't seem to be something that everybody was taking seriously. And then all of a sudden it became mainstream and, getting validation finally that this was something people were willing to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we knew before COVID even hit us here in New York City and on the mainland and the United States that it was becoming an issue. We were very concerned about the rhetoric that was being used by former President Donald Trump and now Speaker Kevin McCarthy. I had approached him literally as a colleague because I said things could lead to more serious attacks if people continue to use phrases like that, even if you're using it unintentionally. I felt really disrespected by him because he didn't even finish listening to me. And I said this in private, I wasn't calling him out publicly or anything. And then, he refused to even hear the rest of my sentence. But you're right in the sense that while many in our community were feeling very concerned, I really don't think that the mainstream started paying attention. And I felt this very strongly, even on Capitol Hill. So after the Atlanta spa shootings happened, I remember speaking to a young staffer who was Asian American who worked on the Hill. And she told me that her colleagues, she was the only Asian American in their office, and that her colleagues approached her and said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know these things were happening to Asian Americans." And this was kind of far in, right? This wasn't in the beginning days.
Right.
And so that was very telling to me that while we were kind of had a heightened sense of what might happen, mainstream America probably did not. And being able to push legislation like the Hate Crimes Act, that really caught momentum after the Atlanta spa shootings. And we had been working on various bills and initiatives way before Atlanta happened.
Throughout this pandemic, over 2 million Asian Americans served our nation as frontline workers, including those in healthcare. And yet some of these same Asian Americans became victims of hate as they were commuting to or from work. Children as young as my 2 boys have been attacked in playgrounds in their own neighborhoods across the country in every single state. Elderly are being assaulted, tragically resulting in deaths. And this culminated in the worst kind of tragedy with the mass shootings in Atlanta. We need to address this hate once and for all. That's why I introduced the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. I am proud the Senate companion bill, led by Senator Hirono, passed in the Senate last month with resounding bipartisan support, 94-1. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act is a necessary step to confront the second pandemic of racism and discrimination. We cannot mend what we do not measure. I strongly urge my colleagues to stand with me and vote for the passage of this bill. I yield back.
Were you somewhat disappointed, though, that it had to get to that point where, it took two very shocking and heinous crimes for almost like this whiplash to happen of a reaction? Because I don't think it would have been difficult to find out that these attacks were happening before 2021. Yeah, it wasn't being covered by the media, but it wasn't hard to find coverage on these attacks happening. And then suddenly it becoming mainstream and people getting behind it, just feeling like, did it have to get this bad for people to care?
Yeah, I did a little bit, but I also felt like the situation was so dire. I was content with any additional attention that we were getting. And in the defense of President Biden and his team, when he first took office, in one of his first public national speeches, he did acknowledge the hate that our community was going through.
Vicious hate crimes against Asian Americans who've been attacked, harassed, blamed, and scapegoated. At this very moment, so many of them are fellow Americans. They're on the front lines of this pandemic trying to save lives. And still, they're forced to live in fear for their lives just walking down streets in America. It's wrong, it's un-American, and it must stop.
And even though those were mere words, the fact that he said this on a national platform, it really moved me. But of course, those are words. And when Atlanta happened, they realized, okay, we really need to do more. And so while, of course, I wish that everyone was moving faster and earlier, I was grateful for the almost like national kind of sweeping momentum that happened after Atlanta.
That's definitely true. Any action is action, right? So that makes a lot of sense. So about the Hate Crimes Act, I remember when this was signed into law, and it felt like a lot of members of our community really saw this as, a very significant moment for our community in terms of this country just recognizing anti-Asian hate has a serious problem. I also did hear some feedback from, conversations with friends and conversations with other people that they felt the act was good. The act was very important, but they also felt it was more symbolic than effective because they saw it as, for one, effectively endorsing policing, which, at the time was very sensitive because of all the scrutiny the law enforcement was getting. And also just, questioning whether this act will really change things. I'm just curious if you've gotten that feedback too, and, how would you respond to that sort of feedback?
I'm totally glad you asked this. I predicted it could happen. I think, while I was grateful for the sudden attention that our community was getting from leaders across the country, I was also a little concerned that it happened so quickly. I don't know if our community had enough time in retrospect to digest what solutions might be needed and how we can collectively, work on what different communities across the country needed. I think everyone was sort of looking towards what can be done today. For example, there's no tracking of hate crimes or bias incidents in this country. So if one were to swoop in on the federal government and look at the overlay of what hate crimes and bias incidents are happening around the country, at the time, it would look like nothing was happening unless someone happened to catch it on a video that went viral. And as helpful as videos are, that's not the most accurate and complete way to keep track of what's happening. And there, I think people saw the legislation and the bill signing as sort of a savior and a magic pill. And I was very worried at the time. I said, this is happening way too fast, knowing that nothing in Congress moves too fast. But I would have loved to have more time to explain that this is only part of the solution. And I say to people today that the bill entails important steps like tracking data and providing money. We created a new grant for grassroots groups that are helping our victims, but that's only part of it, right? Like that's something that comes on the back end of an incident. But the real long-term solution has to come on the front end, right? There are so many people that look at people like me and you, and they don't think of us as real Americans. We've been here for decades, hundreds of years, but people still view Asian Americans, whether you helped build the railroad or whether, you came recently, we're still perpetual foreigners. And so education is very important. We have not spent enough time in this country educating the mainstream communities about our contributions and the trauma that Asian Americans have suffered in this country. So it needs to be a holistic solution.
I agree with you. I think in general, there is a problem in this country with Americans empathizing with our struggle. And I think a lot of it comes down to simply being uneducated about our role in the history of this country, and that we have also been here from the early stages of this country's founding as well. And, I think That's absolutely something that needs to improve. But education is also it's a very long-term solution, like you said. What do you think are some short-term solutions that we can pursue now to get Americans to start caring about us and taking these hate crimes seriously?
It is a long-term solution, but these things are actually happening now. Like New York City has started to implement the teaching of AAPI history. There is curriculum being created by nonprofit groups pushing these bills, many of which are at the state levels, gets people talking about it and gives an opportunity for our allies who are non-Asians to support it, to speak about it publicly, and to talk about it in front of different communities as well. But I think, what I've most appreciated, trying to look at the bright light of this dark time in our history, is the allyship. I think that has been shown and expanded, I think, during this time. For me, my parents were the immigrants. My grandparents were the immigrants who came to this country and didn't necessarily have the tools to be able to expand friendships and allyships amongst different communities. But those conversations are happening with our generation. I remember when this was first happening, I did a Zoom. There was like some Asian American leaders, young leaders, some young African American leaders. This was all in New York City. And for the first time, our two communities, we were just on a Zoom sharing our trauma. And other community leaders got to hear about the most vulnerable in our community, that Asians weren't all rich and educated. And so having that cross-cultural, collaborative dialogue, I think is something that we need to build upon. And that's something we can do now. Like friends can do that with friends. You can join employee resource groups. And I speak to a lot of ERGs intentionally, because sometimes that's the only way I can reach an Asian American who might not be interested in politics. And I advise them to get more involved in their ERG, but also to support ERGs of other communities as well.
I think that's great to hear that kind of solidarity and inter-community dialogue is happening. I do agree it's very much needed. You find a lot of very well qualified, intelligent, and clearly capable Asian Americans working at these big companies who may not have a high political participation rate. And speaking to them at that level may be what pushes them to start getting more involved. So, you kind of mentioned that the Hate Crimes Act, you're fully aware the Hate Crimes Act alone isn't going to be enough to address anti-Asian hate. The premise of the act seems to be, that if we have better data on the nature and magnitude of this problem, like you said, there wasn't a tracking mechanism before on hate crimes, we'll be able to get better, prevention and prosecution measures on hate crimes. To your point, we're going to definitely still need more than that. What are some of those additional things we need at like the policy level to continue fighting anti-Asian hate?
In terms of federal policy, bills like the hate crime bill start by providing an overarching infrastructure or framework. We don't have the capability to measure the extent of this problem, so it becomes very hard to mend it. Mm-hmm. Right? With any problem, with any public health crisis, if you will, of this magnitude, we need to know what's going on, what's happening, where it's happening, how it's happening. And so that bill begins to set up that framework. And the purpose is not necessarily to create more prosecutions and more hate crime convictions. The purpose is to have a more complete and accurate picture of what's happening and where, because if you look at the majority of law enforcement and their reports to Congress, they will say that 0 hate crimes occurred. And this is happening in the largest of our cities across the country. Now, we know that that is not true. We are fortunate that there is social media and phones to capture videos now, but that tool alone is not enough. And the purpose is not just to convict more people of hate crimes, because I've said to people who love the prosecution angle, I said, you could prosecute every single person who touched an Asian, who harassed an Asian. That's not going to get rid of our problem at all, right? The key is still, and I know this sounds cliche, but the key is still education. When I was in the state assembly, actually, I passed legislation. This actually stemmed from a beating of a gay man in Queens. I passed a bill that when someone is convicted of a hate crime, that the judge could require education to replace some of the jail time, the punitive measures of their sentence. And that was a state legislation only. But from the beginning, I have insisted on more education. And another reason why part of the bill is to provide more resources and grants for our local groups is because they're really the ones that are answering to these victims and their families, right? Before something happens and after something happens. And we need to have the capability to be able to work with groups and government to be able to provide the help that they need.
I have another question for you. So, I will admit, one of the most frustrating things that I found when I was attending a lot of these anti-Asian hate rallies the last couple of years was, these rallies tend to get attended by a lot of politicians, a lot of them who weren't even Asian. And I just felt like a lot of them would come to talk about issues that were, adjacent to the issue that we as the community had come there to talk about, which was, racism and attacks against us. But I felt like these politicians would come and talk about, policing and mental health and gun violence and all these other issues that I felt was sort of taking away from the reason why, we as a community were gathering there. And, speaking to friends, they also felt very similarly.
How we treat one another in the face of sickness and mental health as a city. How do we look past the pain of another because we can't sympathize or empathize? We come to declare today we are better.
We have to do this together. I don't want the knee-jerk reaction of going through our subway system and going through our streets and demonizing those who have slipped through the cracks and did not receive the mental health treatment that they deserve.
And I was curious if you noticed that as well. And, if so, what your thoughts were on that.
I think I have a slightly different perspective because I feel like I started out in a time where, first of all, there weren't many, if any, Asian elected leaders in the different levels of government, right? And to get a non-Asian politician at any of our events was virtually unheard of. And so I have seen over the years how that has evolved. Our community has gotten more vocal. Our community has gotten more involved. And I am so grateful for that. So now to this day, when I see non-Asians coming to our events, I'm still grateful because I remember I came up during a time when there was nothing like that. It was like me, John Liu, Margaret Chin, and Peter Koo. That was it, right? And even at a simple Lunar New Year gathering, we couldn't get non-Asian politicians, even if they represented significant Asian populations, which just upset me to no end because I'm like, you can't even do a symbolic festive appearance, right? And so I hear what you're saying. And I think sometimes politicians, because the moment is so short-lived, people may try to just check off that box. What can I do in talking about mental health and public safety and to show that I care about the community? So sometimes they may be good intentioned, but to the average person, let's say if you have a friend who's never been to any event with politicians, it does sound, kind of like, oh, this is not about you. This is about our community and we're hurt. So I can see how that happens.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for sharing that perspective. I think you're right. I was not even aware that that was the case. Even 10 years ago, it was hard to get non-Asians to want to show up to our events and the things that we were putting together for our community. I do remember you also mentioning during that rally for Michelle Go that you weren't going to tolerate any kind of sort of incensing comments made at other communities of color. I'm guessing that's probably where it came from.
And we live in a diverse city. We have different solutions and different answers and different ideas and how we are going to achieve this. Some people want more law enforcement. Some people want less. Some people think more services and mental health support is the answer. And some people even seek to divide us and to try to blame certain communities. I just want to say that none of those solutions on its own is sufficient. This is a complicated problem. The roots are deeply rooted in poverty and racism. And we will not find an answer by simple talking points or just blaming people and pointing fingers. Blaming certain communities and increasing tension will not solve this problem. And I, as an Asian American, want to stand strong and loud and clear that I will not tolerate that.
Interracial solidarity, I think it's really difficult. I think it's gotten better, but it's even when you look at conversations on social media, there's so much pain on both sides.
You can't toggle between both sides and say, well, this happened and we have to look at both sides. You're either for justice or you're not. That's clear.
There's
You're
no
either for
toggling
justice or
here.
not.
And look, I would agree with Hortensia that this should not be a Black Asian thing, and that I understand the emotions run high. The reality is that it does have to start somewhere. And with Officer Liang, he was indicted, he was terminated from the force, he's been found guilty, and he's been sentenced. And so
you can't compare that to all the other cases.
And
that is all.
Is nothing but bones right now with maggots. Peter Liang can sleep in the bed
And I've
under
seen him
the
walking around
cover
Chinatown too.
with his wife. He can have children, cuddle his children. Akai Gurley has a 3.5-year-old daughter. You know what she asks her mom? Why is daddy sleeping so long? No, it's not this is reality. It might not be your reality, but this is the Gurley family reality. And that reality is Peter Liang and the whole NYPD system is accountable.
Both communities are trying to figure out how to get our respective pains about what the other side has done validated in a way that's like constructive and not just, finger pointing.
You, like me, I think are in between different generations and communities, and you hear a lot of conflicting responses, which I think is good. I think there's a real purpose to having someone like you. And I'm glad you brought up that Times Square rally after Michelle Go. Like, I know that there were people mad at me for what I said. No, which is fine. They don't know me. But the thing is, like, that day, more important than talking to the choir that day was talking to some of the Asian reporters that were in the audience. The Asian papers sometimes are very biased.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about when a Black person commits a hate crime, they write Black man in very big letters.
Oh, wow.
But if it's like a white man and sometimes Hispanic, they don't write the race. So that's something that I've talked to them about. And look, they're just trying to do their best too. They don't do it, intentionally maybe. Right. But like behind the scenes, because I feel like you interact with some of these leaders too, like that, those are also some of the dynamics that we have to deal with.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm not gonna lie. When I was at that rally and when I heard you say that, I was like kind of also taken aback. I wasn't upset, but I was also just like, we're in pain now. Yeah. Like we're in pain. Like, why are we getting like a scolding about how to talk?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, that context is very important. It's just, you know where I think it also comes from, Grace? It also just comes from like, even before Michelle Go and even before like, what happened to Vicha and all these things, I'm glad that the conversation you've had with Black people have been constructive, but I'll be quite honest. I tend to see more conversations happening where they're very angry. Like, and they say these things like, which I'm just like, that's not okay to say about us. And I get that Asians haven't been, great at solidarity either, but like, I don't feel like you're trying to understand where we're coming from either. Like I was on a panel last year, it was like a Black and Asian panel. I was asked to do it because the host, she was an African-American radio podcast host. And they asked me Americans to participate. And that's like, and there were a bunch of us there, and the Black panelists, they were just like attacking us. Like they were just like, you people come to our restaurants and you don't even like make eye contact with us, and y'all speaking Chinese, and like it's like ching chong. I don't know if you're talking about me. It's like, why do you got to open up restaurants in our neighborhoods? Like, what's wrong with you? Like they were just shaming us, and I was like, this is not constructive, you know. And I totally don't deny that there are Asians who are just saying very racist things that are not helping the conversation. But I also feel there are a lot of us who are trying to address this with Black people, but we're getting like shut down before we can even say, hey, we're just noticing like a pattern here, and we just want to talk about it. We're not trying to say anyone is like racist, but you know, videos don't really lie either. And I feel like people in our community, if they're seeing like this happening and there's like video to back it up, and all they keep hearing are like people saying, well, you're just getting like a skewed view of it. I don't think people are going to buy into that for very long.
Right. Yeah.
You're not fooling anybody. And why is like no one talking about it?
I know it's so hard and it's so uncomfortable. And I hear that too. And, you know, like I'm so sensitive, like when I'm like walking around Flushing and like, let's say an Asian grandma bumps into a Black grandma and it's the Asian grandma's fault. But, you know, some people in our community, like they might not know how to say sorry, or we're just not as verbose and verbally affectionate, right? For example, you know what my grandma goes around doing when she was more mobile? My grandma thinks she's like fifth generation American.
I too, yeah.
She goes around on the bus and she talks to like other Asian elders, and she's like, you have to say God bless you. When someone sneezes, say God bless you and say thank you. And I'm like, when I was little, I was like, what the heck? Like, but now I'm like extra sensitive to that. I'm like, oh my gosh, like some white or Black person said God bless you to an Asian person, and the Asian person had no reaction, right? And like, I'm not saying that person deserves to get like beat up, but that leads to a lot of misconception.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's just cultural differences.
Yeah, that's where our generation comes in. Like it's unfair to ask like Asian grandma who opened a dry cleaner to be able to have those conversations. I'm sure you know of the work that CAGNY has done through the former president, Charles Yoon. He spent so much time in like Black neighborhoods. So he would bring together Korean business owners in Black communities. And in a very small way, they were able to really get to know each other because there were some incidents that could have, you know, imploded as well.
You know, we're not painting the whole community as being anti-Asian. It's not that, but we're just saying there's like a significant mass of these perpetrators being people of color. And we just want people to just validate that first and then have a conversation about it. Because I think if you can't even acknowledge that, then there's no conversation that's going to come out that's going to be constructive.
I think that's definitely easier at the younger levels, right? Like our generation, I think more of that's happening. I do think it's hard, like for our older parents and grandparents' generations. But this is another example why we need more stats. Like we think because of the videos that every incident is perpetrated by like a Black man, right? But in reality, I'm told, I don't really know, that more incidents actually happen where a white person is a perpetrator. And whether that's true or not, like it's not the nuance of, you know, who does more, but that also, you know, strengthens the narrative that, oh, it's the Blacks who are hating the Asians, right? And I think that makes it a lot more sensitive as well. But at the end of the day, it's like when you talk about Republicans and Democrats, if you don't know someone, it's very easy to paint a very negative picture of them. And I think that's very true of our communities as well.
That's good to know, like that progress is there. And that, you know, ultimately we do need allies at the end of the day, right? We need people to also be willing to stand up and be there with us too. So that's a really good perspective. Just in the time we have left, I just want to know, you know, as you know, political participation historically has not been high among our community, although I think this has gotten a lot better over the years. But, you know, besides voting, what do you think the average citizen can do to help raise awareness? And in addition to that, what do you think Asian Americans can do better as well, besides just voting?
I think you're right that this time in history has really woken up many in our community. People who tell me that they've never gone to a rally before, people who told me that they never registered to vote are telling me that, I took my parents to go vote and I'm attending every rally and I'm volunteering. And I just love to hear that. I do want to make sure that that's something that's going to continue in the long term, because we finally have started to get the attention. It's not that we've been quiet this whole time. It's that the mainstream communities haven't been paying attention to our cries for help. And I hope that now that we've started to get their attention, that we will continue to be involved. And it might not be in dire circumstances or at a rally decrying hate and violence, but just in the very small ways, we need to make sure that our voices are being heard too. The worst thing that could happen is if we disappear into the background and our voting percentage, God forbid, decreases, for example, is something that would be detrimental to us.
In addition to voting, just continuing to speak up, making sure that, people are hearing us, putting ourselves out there. Is that kind of the call to action you would put out to Asian Americans who want to get more involved in these issues?
Yeah, and to get involved not only in our issues, but I think there is a lot to be said for working with other communities. Just because we passed the Hate Crimes Act doesn't mean that our job is anywhere near done. We passed that legislation, and some of my colleagues are literally trying to defund those very grants and programs that we created just 2 years ago. So I know more than anyone else that just passing a law is not the end all be all of solving this problem. And then just, finding ways, again, to strengthen relationships between different communities and working to support their issues as well. We are so much stronger and more effective when we're building these friendships and moving forward together.
Is it me or is it because they scared of us?
On the next episode of The Tiger in the Room, we speak to Perry Young, actor and musician who works in contemporary performance art, television, and film. You may recognize him as the formidable Father June in the hit HBO Max series Warrior, where he commands the screen as the leader of the Hopway Tong. In this episode, we sit down with Perry to discuss the inspiration behind his activism, his experiences navigating the complex landscape of Hollywood as an Asian actor, and his insightful reflections on the evolving dynamics within the Asian community across generations.